Hey everybody, welcome back. It is lesson 3.2. How does the Charter protect individual rights and freedoms? I know my rights, I know my freedoms. Do you really know all of your rights and freedoms? And do you know the responsibilities that come along with those rights and freedoms? We're going to be taking a look at that, and we're going to take a look at a few events that have taken place in Canada's past where rights and freedoms were infringed upon. So there's a lot happening this lesson. This is going to be one of the longer lessons, but is chock full of useful information. So stick around and let's learn something. So like I said in the intro, this is going to be, unfortunately, or fortunately, depends on how you're using this video. This is going to be a long lesson. This is lesson 3.2. How does the Charter protect individual rights and freedoms? We're going to do a little bit of a review about where the Charter of Rights and Freedoms came from. It is a legal document. It protects the interests of Canadians, and it gives us a way to be able to challenge any abuses that might take place from or of basic rights and freedoms through our court system. This all dates back to 1982, when then Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau, so Justin's dad, wanted to make sure that all Canadians, doesn't matter what your citizenship status is, you can challenge your rights and your freedoms in a court of law. And this was all sparked because of issues that were taking place in Quebec at the time, with some social issues that were taking place. So in 1982, the Queen comes and signs this official document, and our Constitution gets patriated. Now, because we have these rights and because they are now protected, if you ever feel like your rights are being violated, then what you can do is you can go to court and you can challenge them. And all Canadians, though, even though we have all of these rights, all of us must follow certain responsibilities in order for these rights to work. So let's take a look at rights and freedoms specifically. A right is any legal, moral, or social expectation that Canadians are entitled to from our government. So the example I'm giving you on this sub-bullet here is, if you are accused of committing a crime, you are entitled to have a lawyer, and you are also entitled to have a fair trial within a reasonable amount of time. And the courts will judge what a reasonable amount of time is, and we'll talk a little bit about that later on in this lesson, about this reasonable amount of time. A freedom is a right where you can live your life without interference from the government. That is, unless you infringe upon the rights of others. And in this lesson, we'll see some examples of where one person's rights will infringe on someone else's rights, and then we'll have to see how the courts decide that. There are 7 parts to our Charter of Rights and Freedoms. We have fundamental freedoms, democratic rights, mobility rights, legal rights, equality rights, official language rights, and minority language education rights. We'll talk about all of these in detail in the coming slides, but I want to highlight the last 2, the official language rights and the minority language rights. We will talk about that in this lesson here, but we take a look at them specifically and in depth in the next chapter when we speak of collective rights. And in the bottom right-hand corner, did you know that every right and freedom is given to everyone in Canada, regardless of citizenship status, except for the right to vote and the right to leave and enter Canada freely? Those 2 rights are only available to Canadian citizens. All right, so let's take a closer look at these 7 parts of the Charter. First, we have our fundamental freedoms. You have the freedom to express your opinion. You have the freedom to choose your own religion. You also have the freedom to organize peaceful meetings or demonstrations. And you also have the freedom to associate with any person or group. But if you remember from a couple of previous slides, you have to have certain responsibilities. Rights and freedoms, unfortunately, they are not without limits. Sometimes we have to limit rights and freedoms so that we can protect others people's rights and freedoms. A really good example would be prisoners. Well, if you've committed a crime, some of your rights and freedoms are going to be taken away because you broke the law. That's just the way it goes. Another example happened in 2011 when you can see here in the pictures, we've got some Vancouver Canuck fans. Riots took place after Game 7 in Vancouver back in 2011. The Canucks were playing the Boston Bruins, and the Boston Bruins defeated the Canucks in Game 7 of the Stanley Cup Finals in Vancouver. People gathered to celebrate. There's nothing wrong with that. That right to gather is protected under your freedom of peaceful assembly. They celebrated and gathered with other hockey fans, which is a freedom of association. But after the Canucks lost, this peaceful assembly kind of turned violent. People were attacking each other. They were setting cars on fire. They were flipping cars. They were looting and they were destroying businesses downtown. So the police had to come in and they had to arrest these people that were taking part in these riots. The freedoms that we have are guaranteed only to such reasonable limits as can be justified in a free and democratic society. So yes, you can gather, yes, you can celebrate, but the second you start to infringe on some other people's rights and their freedoms, then that's when you no longer have those rights and freedoms. Now, these are Vancouver Canuck fans, and we can make fun of them all we want, but we have to be honest here. Edmonton did the same thing in 2006 when the Oilers made it to the Stanley Cup Finals. They didn't win, unfortunately, but these riots were still taking place. And they didn't wait until Game 7 of the Stanley Cup Finals to do this. This happened on a number of game nights. Okay, what about your next rights? These are your democratic rights. Everyone who is a Canadian citizen over the age of 18 has the right to vote. Everyone of that same criteria also has the right to run for public office. Elections, both at the federal level and at the provincial level, must be called every 5 years. And the parliaments and legislatures, they have to sit at least once every 12 months. And you have the right to vote. We are very fortunate in Canada that we do have the right to vote. Every Canadian citizen of age has the right to vote. But there are countries where that right to vote has led to people willing to fight and die for that right to hold governments accountable for their actions. And even today, in countries that are voting in free elections for the first time, oftentimes they will call on Canadian representatives to come over and to oversee their polling stations and to make sure that the votes are counted accurately. You can see on the picture here, we've got a person's fingers being dipped in purple ink to identify that this person has voted and cannot go and vote again during this election. And oftentimes, representatives from other democratic countries like Canada, the United States, Australia, they will go to other countries that are wanting to have free elections. Here in Canada, our right to vote is a birthright. It's something that we're born with, or it's a right that is automatically given to you once you obtain a citizenship status and you are of age to vote. Next up, we have our mobility rights. This is your right to move anywhere within Canada and have an opportunity to earn a living there. You also have the right to enter, stay, or leave Canada as a Canadian citizen. This is one of those rights that are only available to Canadian citizens. You are allowed to move freely within the country. You also have the right to enter and remain in Canada too. So you can't be deported to another country. Let's say, for example, if you commit a crime and you're found guilty, if you are a Canadian citizen, that's just not going to happen. If you want to go to another province, You grew up in one province, you went to school in one province, there's nothing stopping you from going to another province to seek an opportunity in your field of expertise, as long as you can meet the required standards that that province that you're moving to has of you. So for example, if you're a teacher or a lawyer, let's say, and you have your degree from one province, from one university, that gives you the right to practice and to work in that province, but there might be different standards in other provinces. So you would have to meet those qualifications, you would have to meet those standards. As a Canadian citizen, you're more than welcome to move there, but if you wanted to teach or practice law, then you would just have to go through their qualification standards to be able to do that. In the past, we have had provinces that tried to limit these rights in order for local residents to get those available jobs first, because they were concerned that people from other provinces would be able to access certain services easier and whatnot. But it's hard to limit those freedoms of Canadian citizens in these situations. Moving on, we've got legal rights. So you remember this from Chapter 2 when we talked all about the YCJA. And our legal rights state that everyone has the right to be secure against unreasonable search or seizure. And the police, if they want to search you, if they want to search your home or your car or whatever, they have to have a reasonable reason to do so, and usually it's going to be accompanied by a warrant. If they obtain any evidence against you, and if that's obtained in an unlawful way, then that will probably be excluded from trial. You also have the right not to be arbitrarily detained or imprisoned for just no reason whatsoever. If you are being held in custody on reasonable grounds, so let's say they have something to hold you with, then you must be brought before a judge or a justice as soon as possible. So usually within 24 hours of that detention there. You also have the right, if you are arrested or detained, to be informed properly of why you are being detained. And you also have the right to consult counsel, that is to talk to a lawyer, and you have to be told that right too. We know that from the previous chapter, we know that you have the right to a fair trial, and it must be within a reasonable amount of time. Everybody who is accused of committing a crime must be held innocent until proven guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. There's no kind of guilty, kind of not guilty. You're either guilty or you're not guilty. And the Crown Counsel must present the evidence to an unbiased judge or jury to prove your guilt. You, as the defendant, you don't have to prove anything. All of the pressure is on that Crown Counsel. You have the right, staying with legal rights, you have the right to be tried by a judge and a jury when the punishment you are facing is over 5 years of imprisonment. And this ensures that you are judged fairly by your peers and you're keeping the justice system in check with the opinions of normal, everyday Canadians and with those changing community standards. You also have the right not to be compelled as a witness, and you have the right to remain silent when you are accused of a crime. You know this from all like these TV shows and movies that you watch and cartoons that you read and stuff like that, the books. You guys should already know all of this. And lastly, when it comes to legal rights, you have the right not to be subjected to any cruel and unusual punishment from figures in authority, from people in a position of power. There's no cruel and unusual treatment or punishment. And should you receive a punishment, it should fit the crime and it should meet the public standard of acceptability. Those are your legal rights under the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. Equality rights are next. Every individual is equal before and under the law and has the right to equal protection and benefit of the law without discrimination based on the following. You cannot be discriminated against your race. You can't be discriminated against your nationality or your ethnic origin. You can't be discriminated against your color. You cannot be discriminated against your religion. You cannot be discriminated based on your sex. You cannot be discriminated based on age. And you cannot be discriminated against based on mental or physical disability. And this is a right afforded to everybody in Canada, regardless of your citizenship status. These last 5 rights and freedoms in the that we just talked about under the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms is specific to this chapter. The next 2 are going to be dealt with in our next chapter when we talk about collective rights, but I'm quickly going to go over them right now. The first one is official language rights. You have the right to use French or English in courts or within the federal government. Federal laws and any records that the federal government make have to be provided in both French and English. And with regards to French and English, you have the right to use either of those languages when you are dealing with the federal government and any offices that they may have, considering that there is a significant demand for those languages. So you cannot be in a small town in Quebec of a population of 100 people, and if there's a federal office there, you cannot expect them to provide you with English services. Just like a French-speaking Canadian coming to Alberta, for example, and going to a small town that might have a government office there, they can't expect that location to have a French-speaking person. The next right is for collective rights is your minority language education rights, and we'll talk about this again in the next chapter. But this is to preserve the minority language education rights in Canada. So this ensures that French speakers have the opportunity to attend a French-speaking school outside of Quebec, where French is not the majority language, and it gives English speakers the right to attend English-speaking schools in Quebec if English is their primary language. Now, again, this is all determined based on population size. You have to have a significant population of French speakers outside of Quebec to have a French school, and you have to have a significant population of English speakers inside Quebec to have an English-speaking school. So we have, under Canada's Charter of Rights and Freedoms, we have rights and we have freedoms. But with those rights and with those freedoms comes great responsibility. So on this table here, we have your rights and your freedoms across on the left-hand side and your responsibilities on the right. So you have the freedom to express your opinion. Yes, you absolutely do. But your responsibility is to become informed before expressing that opinion and making sure that your opinion doesn't ruin somebody else's reputation. You also need to make sure that your opinions are true and that they are not lies. You have the freedom to choose your own religion, and your responsibilities there are that your religion does not violate other people's rights or even harm them. You have the freedom to organize peaceful meetings and demonstrations, so your responsibilities there are to organize the meetings or demonstrations and ensure that they are peaceful and that your demonstration has a clear purpose. You have the freedom to associate with any person or group as well, but the responsibility there is that your group or the people that you're associating with, you have to make sure that they're not breaking the law or harming others around you. You also know that you have democratic rights. So the responsibility is there. You have to respect the results of elections. And in the current political environment, we see that sometimes that doesn't always happen. But it's your responsibility to respect those rules. And it's also your responsibility to educate yourself and vote when elections occur. You've got mobility rights too. Don't forget that. And your responsibilities there are having a valid passport when you're leaving or returning to Canada. And your rights as a Canadian citizen only apply within Canada, so your responsibility is to obey the laws that are in the country that you are visiting. You're not protected by the Charter of Rights and Freedoms in other countries. You have legal rights, so your responsibilities there are easy. Don't break the law. And you have the right to be free of discrimination. So your responsibilities with regard to this right is that you pursue action. If you are discriminated against, you are to pursue action against, or through legal means rather, to uphold those rights. And your responsibility as well is to not discriminate against other people or groups. Now it's time to take a look at what the Charter reflects about our past, about Canada's past. We are going to take a look at some past events that have taken place in Canada and what life was like before the Charter came into existence. We're going to start with the Indian Act, and we are going to be taking a much closer look at the Indian Act in the next chapter when we talk about collective rights, but we're just going to touch on it now and give us a little bit of background information to be prepared for the next chapter. During the 1867, during Confederation, our Indigenous people were not consulted as to what is going to be done with their land and with their rights. So the federal government took it upon themselves to create a document called the Indian Act. And the Indian Act is still in existence today. This was an attempt to assimilate our Indigenous people for them to become more European-like. So how did the government do this? Well, it prevented them from wearing any traditional clothing without having permission first from the government, and it banned traditional ceremonies for certain groups within Canada. If the document, the Charter of Rights and Freedoms document existed back then, they would then have grounds to fight that in a court of law. Another example is going to be the women's right to vote. And during the early part of the 1900s, women, while they weren't seen as participating members of society, so they could not vote. They had no say in what they wanted in government. But in 1876, Emily Howard Stowe, who was Canada's first female doctor, she goes and she creates a club that promotes women's suffrage, which is the right to vote. It did take over 40 years for this movement to catch on, but finally in 1918, women are granted the right to vote. Now, some other things that happened in Canada's past revolve around the wars that were taking place, World War I and World War II specifically, where Canada enacted something called the War Measures Act, a government act that is invoked during a time of war, a time of invasion, or violent uprising against a government. So like in insurrection, let's say, for example. And basically what the War Measures Act does is it gives the government the ability to suspend the rights of people. And it has been used 3 times in Canada: World War I, World War II, and the October Crisis of 1970. So let's start with World War I. Where was the War Measures Act used in World War I? Well, it was used against Ukrainian Canadians, because when World War I, when Canada was at war with Germany, Canada was also at war with Austria-Hungary and Ukraine as well. So what the government did is they went and they arrested Ukrainian Canadians and put them into internment camps, and they forced them to work hard labor without pay. It took until 2005 for the government of Canada to finally apologize and pass the Internment of Persons of Ukrainian Origin Act for the things that happened to Ukrainian Canadians during the First World War. During World War II, we see this happening again. The War Measures Act is taking place. Italy declares war on Canada in 1940, so therefore the Canadian government rounds up Italian Canadians and again forces them into internment camps, and they go and they seize the property owned by Italians. In 1990, finally, Prime Minister Brian Mulroney apologizes for this and goes and they provides Italians with some compensation, but it takes a lot of time for that to finally take place. Also, during World War II, Italy declares war on Canada, but the United States is now in the war, and Japan attacks the United States at Pearl Harbor. And the Canadian government is worried that a similar attack could take place on Canadian soil. So the Canadian government goes and rounds up people of Japanese origin, especially those living on the West Coast, gathers them all up, brings them into the interior of Canada, and forces them to work without pay. The government said to these Japanese families that were interned not to worry about their possessions, not to worry about their businesses. Everything is going to be taken care of. This is going to be a temporary internment for temporary measures. And when the war is over, these Japanese families return to the West Coast. They find that their homes and their possessions have been sold, and their businesses as well. So they come back to their life with nothing to their name. In 1988, the government does apologize to the Japanese, and only some receive compensation for that internment. We see the War Measures Act again used during the FLQ crisis, the October crisis in 1970. And before we talk about the FLQ crisis, we're going to do a little bit of vocabulary words here. We've got nationalism. Nationalism means it's a patriotic feeling of principles or efforts. Then there's a nationalist, is a person with strong patriotic feelings, especially one who believes in the superiority of their country over others. And then we have separatist, a person who supports the idea of separation of a particular group of people from a larger body on the basis of ethnicity, religion, or gender. And in our opening lesson, as to one of the reasons why the Charter of Rights and Freedoms was created was because of the social upheaval that was taking place in Quebec in the 60s, the 70s, and the 80s when they had that referendum. And one of these events that was taking place was this FLQ crisis. FLQ is the Front de Libération de Quebec. My French is poor, my apologies. And FLQ, they lasted between 1963 and 1970. The group was created in the 60s there, in the early 60s, as their primary goal to gain independence from Canada. And it was in 1970 that the FLQ really started to amp up their efforts to become recognized. So how did they do this? Well, they went and they kidnapped a British trade commissioner, and they held this trade commissioner essentially for ransom, and they wanted two main things to take place. Number one, they wanted the government to read the FLQ manifesto, and they wanted their political prisoners to be released from jail. And Prime Minister Trudeau at the time refused to do these things. So when the demands of the FLQ were not met, they go and they kidnap a labor minister of Quebec, which is a really scary thing to happen. This all prompted many young French Canadians to start backing this movement. But at the same time as the FLQ was gaining popularity, this made government officials really scared and fearful for their lives. The Quebec Premier at the time asked the Prime Minister to put the War Measures Act in place and suspended the rights of all people living in Montreal at the time. Eventually, the FLQ crisis does come to an end, but it doesn't come to an end in a very peaceful way. Some of the key players during the FLQ crisis are Prime Minister Trudeau. He is the Prime Minister of Canada during that time. Robert Bourassa is the Premier of Quebec. Paul Rose is the leader of the FLQ at that time. René Lévesque is the leader of the Parti Québécois. James Cross is the British Trade Commissioner that gets kidnapped. And Pierre Laporte is the Quebec Minister of Labour that gets kidnapped. And all of this comes to an end after Pierre Laporte is found murdered in the back of a car. And the War Measures Act went in and allowed the government to storm people's homes. It limited people's rights, and it helped bring an end to the FLQ crisis. Now, these last examples with the Indian Act, with the women getting the right to vote, the internment of Ukrainians, Italians, and Japanese, and now the FLQ, Crisis are some examples of Canada's past before the Charter of Rights and Freedoms was created, and the changes that we've made and the strides that we have made as a country since then. All right, I want you to head over to your notebook and complete the questions for this part of the chapter.